Welcome back to App Stories. Today's show is brought to you by Concepts and ZocDoc. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm doing really well. We had a good conversation about home automation during the Plus segment for App Stories Plus subscribers and Club Premier members. If you're interested in learning more about some of Federico's explorations of things like Home Assistant and Linux and all those kinds of good things, you should check it out. And you can get App Stories Plus early, ad-free, and extended every single week by going to plus.club or appstories.plus, because you can either subscribe at appstories.plus or you can become a Club Premier member and get App Stories Plus and all the other great things that we do in the club there. Okay, Federico, today I think we need to talk about something that I posted on Mastodon that really
you came up with this and you posted about it, and then you got a bunch of people replying to you. So this is all a discussion of your own making. And yes, please go ahead. Tell me what's on your mind.
So I saw on TechCrunch during last week, I saw that TechCrunch reported that Pocket was abandoning its Mac app. Now, I don't really care about Pocket's Mac app, to be honest. I mean, I don't use Pocket. I've never really found Pocket to be all that compelling as a service. And I know, having used its Mac app before, that it was never a particularly good Mac app to begin with.
I totally forgot that a Pocket Mac app even exists.
Well, right, exactly. I mean, and look, so on the one hand, this is not an interesting story in a way, but I posted it in a way to really kind of draw out people's thoughts on native Mac apps, because I didn't really take a position on this in my post, but I said that you have two options now with Pocket. You can either use the iPad app in compatibility mode, which I guess Pocket offers, or you can use their web app. And I got a lot of replies from people of all the flavors that you could imagine. Everything from the native Mac app is doomed, and I miss the good old days of lickable apps, to why would anybody care? It's a web service. It can be just used in a browser tab. All of which I think are kind of valid, because this is like one of those Rorschach test types of stories that hits the internet, where it's like you can kind of see whatever your point of view is in the news that Pocket is quote, abandoning the Mac. Really, it's not, because as I said, you can use the iPad app, and we can talk about whether iPad apps are any good on the Mac if you want to, and you can use the web. But it did make me think about one thing, which is how there's so many different ways now to build apps, and those ways are all kind of pointing in the direction of, I'd call it a consistent UI between all of Apple's platforms. There's a lot more about a modern Mac app that looks like an iPad app today than there was 5 years ago, for instance. And on the one hand, I think some people look at that who are traditional Mac users who have been around for a while, really like the Mac, maybe grew up in the delicious library days, the delicious generation, right? Which is, I think pretty about when you and I were. I mean, you were probably using a Mac before that too, but
I was using a Mac. I remember when Delicious Library 2 came out.
Yeah, that's kind of the era that I grew up in too. And I don't miss it, to be honest. I think that those, to me, peak Delicious generation was when, do you remember that CD ripping app came out that actually smoked while you're ripping your CD? You're copying your... You remember that? I forget.
Yes. So I have a theory. All right.
Okay.
So when people say that they miss the delicious sort of generation of Mac software, they don't really miss the software. They miss a time in their lives when things were easier, and maybe they were younger, and maybe there's an old album by Blur, the British band,
right?
I believe I don't recall if it's their debut album or the second or their sophomore record. They have an album called Modern Life is Rubbish. And I think that's such a great title.
That is good.
Because it because it never gets old, and then it's the kind of phrase and expression that only gets more true over time. When you think about it, modern life is rubbish, right? It gets more complicated as you get older. There's more challenges, and modern times are not great. And so I feel like when people say that they miss all this to say that when people say that they miss iOS 6, or when people say that they miss delicious Mac software, or when people say, oh, it used to be better, playing video games on a PlayStation 2, these things may seem unrelated, but they are not. Because ultimately people, and this is sort of excuse me for getting a bit philosophical here, John, but I think I truly believe in this. People associate tech products, video games, music, any form of entertainment with specific periods of their lives. And it's not like, I would bet a serious amount of money that if you gave a Mac user today a MacBook Pro from 2006 with older software, ultimately it would maybe satisfy an intellectual curiosity, but they wouldn't like it. They wouldn't actually like it, because software and hardware is better today. It's just that you are nostalgic about when you were younger.
Right. And I think that there's also an aspect of, making an app in 2000 that shows an animated CD smoking as with particle effects and everything as the CD is being ripped was not super easy back then with the hardware and technology that we had. And so it was more surprising and delightful and interesting. Whereas now I think people would look at it and think of it more as a gimmick. I think I look back on it and think of it as a gimmick personally, but there's a lot going on here because, Pocket is from an age gone by, which really plays into that nostalgia factor. A lot of people still use it though. And it's also, let's not forget that it's owned by a big company. It's owned by Firefox. And so there's always this, I think, when a company that's the size of Firefox announces that they're leaving a platform, there is concern that it, is a harbinger of more problems for that platform going forward. And there is a part of me that looks at this news and thinks, this is not generally good for the Mac, because I feel like we're entering an era where an awful lot of the software we use is no longer being created as native and is instead being, just put in a browser tab. And that does bother me to a degree, because I do feel like, and this is one of those things where I don't think there's an easy answer here, because I really do feel as though Pocket is just as good in a browser tab as it would be in an app. So I do feel that like there's a place for certain services to live in the browser. I also feel like there are certain kinds of apps where it's totally okay to use an iPad app in compatibility mode. And to me, that this is like kind of comes down to the kind of tool you're using. Like, I'm not going to use a text editor that's running in compatibility mode on my Mac. I'm just not, because it's too important to me. But if I'm going to go grab a URL from some app so I can open it up again, maybe it's like a bookmark manager, for instance, I might be okay with that being an iPad app if I have reasons to want to use that app on the iPad too. I think it's a lot of it is a matter of degree. And I think if we were in a world where the only way to build a Mac app today was still AppKit, I think the Mac would be in a huge amount of trouble. What makes me concerned, though, at times is when companies make the decision less based on what the app should be and what the cheapest cost-effective route is, which often involves, things like poorly designed web wrappers or just throwing things in the browser, when they'd probably be better served taking a little time and either making like a Catalyst app or a full-on Mac app with some AppKit in there too. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Concepts. Sketch, explore, and share endless ideas with Concepts' infinite canvas for iPad. Designed for creators of all types, the app is ideal for visual thinking, note-taking, drawing, and professional design. Concepts lets you interact with and edit your sketches, helping you think and draw smarter. Because everything you draw is a vector, you can move, edit, and organize your sketches after you draw them using natural gestures. You can also sketch freely with liquid pens, markers, and brushes in designer Copic colors. Create mood boards with images, PDFs, and objects, then draw right on top of them. And you can design with tools like grids, snap, and real-world measurements to create professional projects. Plus, connect your device to any display for instant whiteboarding with the built-in presentation mode. Concepts is used by designers and illustrators at Apple, Disney, PlayStation, Unity, and other companies globally to sketch, design, and communicate visually. Concepts comes free as a basic sketching app with the ability to unlock features via a subscription or one-time purchase. Just visit concepts.app today to learn more and check this app out. And there's a special promotion just for App Stories listeners. You can get a free 90-day trial of Concepts Pro by visiting the link in the show notes. So be sure to check out that link and sign up for your free trial. Our thanks to Concepts for their support of the show.
Typically on your Mac. And I think obviously you use your Mac more than I do, especially now that Stage Manager is good on iPadOS.
Right.
I feel like I can be true to I can be true to my real self again and love the iPad again. We talked about this. But anyway, you use macOS more than I do. And be honest with me here. How many of these apps that are either Mac Catalyst apps or iPad apps in compatibility mode do you actually use on a daily basis?
I use a lot of Catalyst apps, I think. There are a lot of Catalyst apps out there now, but I don't use things in compatibility mode for the most part. I mean, I don't, because, and a lot of that is because I use multiple devices. And that's maybe another factor here worth kind of exploring, which is if you don't use multiple Apple hardware devices simultaneously, it really makes a lot of sense to have compatibility mode so that when you're using your laptop, you can access things like your iPad apps. I've got universal control. I've got my iPad right here. I don't need to run those apps on my Mac to get the use out of them. The iPad's here all the time. So is my iPhone. So no, I don't really use compatibility mode apps very often. I really do like, though, which is a form of compatibility, the new widgets that are coming to Sonoma, the desktop widgets, which can be widgets that are running on your phone but showing up on your Mac, which to me is pointing where Apple's heading with all this, which is kind of breaking apps apart into component parts and mixing and matching across different systems where it makes sense. And I think it does make sense to have your phone sitting on a desk, but have your widgets showing up on your desktop, on your Mac, where you're actually doing the work at the, when you're sitting at your desk.
I feel like and this is a discussion that we've had many times before. How can you make, for some companies, right? I mean, look at Slack, look at Figma, look at, in this case, Pocket, any company that has a pretty big team and they want to be a cross-platform service, right? And it's fine, right? There's the indie developer, there's Timery Joe that wants to make a time tracking utility just for Apple platforms. And there's the folks at Figma, or there's, in this case, Pocket, or there's Matter or Readwise. They want to make apps, they want to make services for multiple platforms, different priorities. But to these companies, how do you make a compelling case that instead of going for the lowest common denominator for Mac software, they should do a native Mac app? Because ultimately, I prefer, maybe this is an unpopular opinion to have these days. I prefer native software, right? I prefer native apps that have all the bells and whistles of Apple platforms, widgets, shortcuts, extensions, native animations, the native feel. Like, I prefer that. But also, I don't feel like I can blame some companies, including Mozilla here with Pocket, for saying, well, we just don't want to support the Mac with a native app anymore. And if you want, just use the iPad one in compatibility mode or go to the web. Like, can I actually blame them? And I don't think I can. And so honestly, whenever we have these sort of controversies, right? Because they spin up from time to time. Actually, I feel like this flavor of controversy has become more frequent than the other controversy that usually spins up and eventually dies down and spins up again, which is the iPad one.
Right.
Ultimately, I feel like I fall in the camp of it's a small market for macOS. There's a much bigger market with users that have a web browser on a desktop computer. And if you are a big company and you need to optimize resources and salaries these days, why would you do it?
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And, I think the primary things you lose for something like Pocket is, and maybe they have this, I have not looked, I will admit, but, if Pocket, if they're not going to have a native app, they should have at least a Safari extension so that people can save to it more easily on the Mac. Another thing that you lose is things like share sheet support. But, honestly, the share sheet on the share menu on the Mac has never been very good. And it doesn't seem like Apple's interested in improving it. I mean, I literally find that one of the most frustrating things on my Mac day to day. And one of the reasons I use an iPad side by side with my Mac is that it's very difficult for me to move URLs or images or whatever it happens to be into other apps using the share sheet. It is so good on iOS and iPadOS, but on the Mac, it's hamstrung and it doesn't work very well. It drives me bananas. Yeah. It really drives me.
I'm gonna give you another way to look at this, okay, which I think you will appreciate. Catalyst and all these other tools for sort of converting an iPad app into a Mac app, and the Mac game porting toolkit are the same thing.
Oh, yeah.
Are two sides of the same coin. And if anything, Apple should continue this strategy. Mac Catalyst, the game kit, the Mac game porting toolkit, there should be as big an effort, if not a similar technology, to make sure that Safari and WebKit can be as modern and as compatible with Google Chrome.
Right. And this is why we have single site web apps coming to macOS Sonoma, right? Because this is exactly for the Pocket situation where Pocket decides, Firefox decides, well, we don't, not only do we not want to make a Mac native app anymore, we don't even want to bother with Catalyst. You can have compatibility mode, which is there, or you can use it in the web. And I think for a lot of people, at least I would, if I were a Pocket user, I would immediately set up one of these single purpose web apps that are coming to Sonoma. I think that that's absolutely true. And I don't think that I would lump Catalyst in with web apps in the sense that, yes, it's possible to make a very bad Catalyst app, but especially for the developers who are willing to dig into AppKit a little bit and fill out where Catalyst can't really match native Mac software, you can make a really good Catalyst app. And, you mentioned Timery before. Timery's a Catalyst app. I mean, and it's a good Catalyst app. There are a bunch of good Catalyst apps out there that I use pretty much every day. So I feel like those are kind of in a middle ground. And the risk with Catalyst apps is that developers don't take the time to really take them beyond the box checking of Catalyst apps and make them into something that's a little more robust and fits in with the Mac system. But that's probably the best route for someone, I think, who's coming from the iPad to begin with. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by ZocDoc. Have you ever been on the hunt for a new doctor and you ask everyone you know for the recommendation? I mean, it makes sense. You want a doctor who actually gets you, listens to you, and makes you feel super comfortable. And then finally, after weeks of searching, you find one that you like. They meet all of your requirements and then some. So you call the office and they have an appointment available. Then you find out your perfect doctor doesn't take your insurance. Don't worry, head on over to ZocDoc to find and book a doctor who is right for you and takes your insurance. ZocDoc is a free app where you can find amazing doctors and book appointments online. We're talking about booking appointments with thousands of top-rated, patient-reviewed doctors and specialists. You can filter specifically for ones that take your insurance, are located nearby, and treat almost every condition under the sun. These doctors all have verified reviews from actual real patients, not bots. And the average wait time to see a doctor who's booked through ZocDoc is between 24 and 48 hours. That's it. You can even get same-day appointments. Once you find the doctor you want, you can book them immediately with just a few taps. So no more waiting awkwardly on hold with a receptionist. ZocDoc is really a fantastic way to find a doctor. I went through this process when I moved to North Carolina, and it really sped up the process because I didn't really know where to go or who took our insurance, because we had new insurance and we lived in a new place and didn't have any doctors lined up. So we spent some time going through ZocDoc, and we're able to find people really quickly and easily who take our insurance and are located nearby. So it was really easy to get up and running with a whole new set of doctors for myself and for the rest of my family. Go to ZocDoc.com/appstories and download the free ZocDoc app today. Then open it up and find and book a top-rated doctor. That's ZocDoc.com/appstories. ZocDoc.com/appstories. Our thanks to ZocDoc for their support of the show.
And I guess what I really mean is that I struggle to imagine that bigger companies are going to start making Mac software again. And if anything, Apple will even has a new challenge now, which is convincing some big companies to make Vision OS software. I mean, look at what Netflix has said, for example, right? I think Apple's challenge now is to convince companies to make Vision Pro apps, not necessarily Mac apps. So I think that ship has sailed, right? Trying to convince, you should really make an AppKit app native to the Mac. Again, not that I wouldn't love it, because I would. I just don't think it's going to happen.
Right.
But I think that Apple should accept the reality of the situation. And just like they're doing with video games, they should continue investing into tools that allow you to take the kinds of apps that developers are making, right? Which is web apps and iPad apps. Because, let's face it, they're making apps for the web and they're making apps for tablets. And by tablets, I mean iPad, because people buy iPads and people have iPads, kids have them, older people have them. Everybody has an iPad.
And it's a similar size market to the Mac. So it makes a lot of sense to kind of bring the iPad and the Mac together and double that market for people who are making that software.
Yeah. And so I feel like they should continue to invest resources into making sure that the two types of apps that are more similar to a desktop environment, so the iPad versions and the web versions, can be installed and used and enjoyed on a Mac with as few compromises as possible.
Yeah,
right?
agreed.
So, but like I said, the new challenge on the horizon, I feel like, is, now there's a new platform coming out, right? Look at all these platforms that Apple has. There's iPhone. Sure, companies are making iPhone apps. There's iPad. They're making fewer native iPad versions. Look at Instagram, right? They still don't have an iPad version, but it's definitely more popular than the Mac. There's the Mac. Essentially, indie developers are now making native Mac software, right? And it's fine. We love them. We literally give an award to those developers each year.
Right.
So I'm not here to say I hate Mac software. No, I love Mac software, but it's become more of a niche thing, if it ever was.
Well, and I think what a Mac app is today has fundamentally changed. I think thinking in terms of native kind of is part of the problem, because especially with things like Catalyst is it is one of the ways you make a Mac app today. I think the apps on the Mac now occupy an entire spectrum from what we would call fully native, which is basically old school AppKit apps, which is what people are familiar with and is a very good way to make software for the platform, all the way down to these single site web apps. So I think it's a continuum. And I agree that Apple has to continue to invest the resources to make sure that at every spot along that spectrum, that it's possible to make an app that both looks good and works well on Mac OS.
Yeah. And then what do we have? tvOS, nobody's making tvOS apps.
No.
watchOS, very few developer. There's the occasional.
I think it's getting a little better. I really
It's getting better. For a while, it really was kind of equivalent to the Mac, which is, indie developers are making native watch apps. But I do feel like it's getting better, and Apple is investing resources into that ecosystem because they have realized, maybe we should, really embrace widgets and complications and redesign how apps are designed and made. So that's getting better. But now the real challenge on the horizon is,
Vision OS.
Vision OS. And look what's happening. They are starting from a foundation of, take the existing app that you have made, which is an iPad 1, and then you can optimize it to make it look and feel even more native on watchOS. So in many ways, the shift in how apps are made that we have witnessed on app stories over the past few years is not necessarily, it is about the technologies being used, sure. But from a big picture perspective, there's really the iPad and WebKit at the center of it all, right? The iPad powering 3 platforms, not one, right? iPad, Mac, and Vision OS, and WebKit just being WebKit with Safari and web apps that are continue to get better as they should. So I feel like this is not the kind of evolution that I was expecting if you asked me 5 years ago.
No.
And yet here we are.
Yeah, well, and I think the iPad has some advantages because the way it can scale to different use cases and different types of hardware better than something like a traditional Mac OS UI where you need a more precise and small, touch target, or not touch target, but pointer target than you would with an iPad. So I get why that is. And I think it's the widgetification of all of the platforms is another aspect of this, where apps aren't just apps anymore. They're components that can show up in a bunch of different places, whether it's a widget or whether it's in shortcuts or whatever it happens to be, notifications, all those things are ways to break apart functionality in a way that runs on more platforms. All right, Federico, I have a feeling we'll be talking about this more as things continue to evolve. To me, it's super exciting that there's so many different ways and approaches to making apps today. As a result, with so many options, you're necessarily going to run into some attempts and experiments that just don't work and aren't that great. But I think it also means a lot of opportunities for developers as well. Yeah. I want to thank our sponsors again for this episode of App Stories. That's Concepts and ZocDoc. You can find me and Federico over at macstories.net. Federico is on Mastodon. Just go to vitici.macstories.net to follow him there, or johnvorhees.macstories.net to follow me. We're both on Instagram too, where Federico is at Vitici. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees. JOHNVOORHEES. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.